A while ago, I posted a video about detachment. It was a simple idea that sometimes the ability to step back, to loosen your grip on an outcome, can change the way you move through the world and, strangely enough, make it easier to reach the things you want. There's a small irony in the way that video came into existence because when I posted it, I was completely detached from what would happen to it. I didn't check the analytics every hour, I didn't think about how it might perform, and I didn't really expect anything in particular. I had been reflecting on that idea for a while and it felt important enough to share, even if only as a reminder to myself. So I recorded the video, uploaded it, and left it there. And somehow it became the most successful video on this channel so far. It's now sitting somewhere close to 1 million views, which is still strange to say out loud. In a way, it's a perfect little example of the very thing the video was talking about. The one time I didn't feel the need to force an outcome, the one time I didn't obsess over how it would be received, that's the moment things seem to unfold on their own. After that video started circulating, I began receiving a lot of messages from people who said the idea resonated with them. Many of you wrote something along the lines of, "I know exactly what you mean." It was interesting because the reactions often carried the same tone. People didn't seem surprised by the concept itself. If anything, the responses suggested that many of us already have an intuitive sense that detachment holds a certain kind of power. And thinking about those reactions later on, something else started to settle in my mind. The idea of detachment isn't particularly new or exotic. It has existed in one form or another for a very long time. Different cultures have spoken about it, different philosophies have tried to describe it, and many people seem to arrive at it almost intuitively at certain points in their lives. Most of us have felt some version of it before, even if we didn't have a clear word for it. Moments when things seem to move more freely, precisely because we stop trying to control every outcome. Moments when the pressure softened and somehow the path forward became clearer. That small shift in perspective can change the way we approach almost anything: work, relationships, ambitions, creative projects, even the way we interpret success itself. And yet, detachment is often misunderstood. Sometimes it gets confused with indifference or with a lack of effort or with the idea that you shouldn't care about what happens. But after thinking about it for a while, I realized the idea is a bit more complex than it first appears. It has a lot to do with the way we carry our desires while moving through life. Before starting, I want to share something I've been doing recently because it connects to everything I've been thinking about. I realize that a lot of the time, especially when it comes to creativity, I tend to put pressure on the outcome without even noticing it. Even something simple can start to feel like it has to be good or lead somewhere. So I wanted to find something that would bring me back to just doing without that constant layer of expectation. That's what led me to Skillshare. I started exploring some of their classes and I ended up taking one called The Power of Sketching, daily drawing practices to restore, refocus, and reignite your creativity by Kyle Aaron Pearson. What I liked about it right away is that it doesn't try to turn you into an expert. It's much more about building a simple, consistent practice. The exercises are very approachable and they focus on helping you reconnect with the act of creating in a more relaxed way. I've been doing it mostly on my iPad, sometimes just with a sketchbook, and it's become this small moment in the day where I can just focus on the process. There's no pressure for it to turn out in a certain way, and that actually makes it easier to keep coming back to it. That's something I've noticed more broadly with Skillshare. It's not just about watching lessons, you're encouraged to actually make things, to follow along, to experiment a bit. The classes are taught by people who are deeply involved in what they do, so it feels very grounded and real. There's also a strong sense of community around it. You can see what other people are creating, get feedback, and feel like you're part of something instead of just learning on your own. And at the same time, it's completely flexible. You can take classes at your own pace whenever you want and fit them into your routine without it becoming overwhelming. If you've been wanting to explore something creative or even just step away from constant scrolling and do something a bit more intentional with your time, it's a really nice space for that. The first 500 people to use my link in the description or scan the QR code will receive a 1-month free trial of Skillshare. In the previous video, I focused more on on the practical side of detachment, especially how it shows up in relationships and everyday situations. I didn't spend much time exploring the psychological and philosophical side of it. That's what I want to explore in this video. Before bringing in any stories or examples, it's probably useful to pause for a moment and clarify what we even mean when we talk about detachment, because the word itself can be a little misleading. For many people, detachment immediately sounds like distance in a cold sense. It can almost feel like the idea is telling us to care less, to suppress desire, to become indifferent to what happens. And that interpretation is understandable because the word itself suggests separation. But the kind of detachment we're talking about here is not emotional numbness, and it's not apathy. It's closer to a shift in the way you hold things internally. Most of us are used to relating to our goals, our plans, and our desires with a very tight grip. When we want something, the mind tends to wrap itself around the outcome. We start imagining what it will feel like when it finally happens. We replay scenarios in our heads. We measure our progress constantly, and slowly the result begins to occupy more mental space than the process itself. At that point, the outcome starts carrying a lot of weight. Our mood moves up and down with every small signal. A good sign feels like a relief. A setback feels like a personal failure. The whole experience becomes emotionally charged in a way that can make even simple things feel heavy. Detachment softens that grip. The desire can still be there, the effort can still be there, the goal doesn't disappear. What changes is the relationship you have with it while you're moving toward it. Instead of living mentally in the future results, your attention stays closer to the action itself, the work, the practice, the small steps that exist in the present moment. The outcome remains a direction rather than something you're psychologically clinging to. That difference might sound subtle, but it changes the texture of the entire experience. When the grip loosens, there's usually more room for curiosity. You're more willing to try things, to explore different paths without feeling that every step carries enormous consequences. The work becomes easier to sustain because it isn't constantly being evaluated through the lens of, is this finally giving me what I want? In a strange way, detachment often brings people closer to what they're doing. It allows them to be fully involved in the process without being mentally pulled forward by the result every few minutes. The mind becomes quieter, the pressure decreases, attention settles where the work actually happens. And once you start recognizing this dynamic, you begin to notice how often the opposite pattern appears in everyday life. Many of us have experienced moments where wanting something too intensely seemed to make the whole situation feel heavier and more complicated. The more importance we place on a specific outcome, the more tension enters the process of trying to reach it. That tension can show up in subtle ways: overthinking decisions, second guessing every step, constantly checking whether things are working, or feeling discouraged the moment progress doesn't appear immediately. Detachment interrupts that cycle. It doesn't remove ambition, and it doesn't eliminate desire. What it does is change the emotional pressure attached to the result. The goal is still there, but it's no longer the thing dominating every thought along the way. And this is something I started noticing in a slightly unexpected way. Sometimes when I'm cooking or cleaning or doing something repetitive, I like to listen to long videos or podcasts about historical figures, biographies mostly, stories about inventors, artists, scientists, people who built something unusual with their lives. The kind of videos that slowly walk through someone's path, where they started, what they cared about, the strange turns their life took along the way. After listening to enough of these stories, a certain pattern began to stand out to me. Different people, different periods of history, completely different kinds of work. Yet, something about the way they approached what they were doing felt strangely familiar. Before going further, it's worth clarifying what I mean when I use the word success here. I'm not referring only to money, status, or public recognition. Success can mean many things depending on the person. For some people, it's building something meaningful. For others, it's reaching a level of mastery in a craft. Sometimes it simply means following an idea that feels deeply important to you and seeing where it leads. Many of the people whose stories I was listening to eventually became widely respected for what they created. Their work shaped technology, culture, or the way we understand the world. What caught my attention wasn't just what they achieved, it was the way they spent their time before any of that recognition existed. Their days seemed to revolve around curiosity, ideas, problems, experiments, sketches, questions, long stretches of time dedicated to understanding something that fascinated them. The work itself held their attention. Hedy Lamarr is a good example of this. Most people know her as a Hollywood actress from the 1940s. She was considered one of the most beautiful women in the film industry at the time. What many people don't realize is that behind the scenes, she had a strong interest in engineering and technical systems. During the Second World War, she worked with a composer named George Antheil on a communication system designed to prevent radio signals from being jammed. The concept relied on frequency hopping, a method where signals rapidly change to avoid interference. At the time, the invention didn't receive much attention. The military didn't really pursue the idea in any serious way. Years passed. Later on, the same concept became essential for technologies that now surround us. Wireless communication systems, Wi-Fi, Bluetooth. Lamarr didn't build her identity around being recognized as an inventor. She simply spent time thinking about problems that interested her. Nikola Tesla's story carries a similar atmosphere. Tesla had an extraordinary ability to imagine machines in his mind with incredible detail. Many accounts describe how he could visualize entire systems long before they were physically built. His life revolved around ideas about electricity, energy, and the hidden structures that govern the physical world. He worked obsessively with very little concern for financial reward. Business strategy never seemed to occupy his attention in the same way his ideas did. Several times in his life, he stepped away from agreements that could have made him extremely wealthy. What mattered to him was continuing the work. What's interesting is that recognition eventually arrived anyway. Some of these people saw their work appreciated during their lifetime, others were understood much later, sometimes decades after they were gone. Yet their contributions still found their place in the world. Listening to these stories again and again left me with a strange impression. They didn't spend their energy trying to control the outcome of their work. Their attention stayed on the part they could actually influence, the effort they put into the work itself. Everything else unfolded on its own timeline. If you look at the lives we just talked about, one word keeps appearing in the background: obsession. I realize this might sound slightly confusing, especially if you watched my previous video. In that video, I talked about how obsession can push success away. Looking back at it now, I think what I was trying to say didn't come across very clearly, because obsession itself is not the problem. In many cases, it's actually the engine behind meaningful work. Most people who became deeply skilled at something spend an enormous amount of time thinking about it, practicing it, returning to it again and again. Their attention keeps circling back to the same activity because something about it genuinely interests them. That kind of obsession can be very healthy. It happens when the focus is placed on the activity itself, on the process, on the craft, on the curiosity that keeps pulling you back into it. You wake up thinking about the idea, you spend hours experimenting, practicing, adjusting things, not because you're forcing yourself to do it, but because the act of doing it feels rewarding in its own way. Many musicians describe this feeling when they're learning an instrument. Hours pass while they repeat the same passage over and over, slowly refining it. Writers experience something similar when they spend long stretches of time shaping a paragraph or exploring an idea. Scientists often talk about losing track of time while trying to understand a problem. In all of those situations, the attention is anchored in the work. The person isn't constantly calculating what the final result will look like or how impressive it might appear to others. The activity itself becomes absorbing enough to hold the mind there. And when obsession takes that form, it tends to nourish the person doing it. It builds skill, depth, understanding. Over time, it shapes the way someone thinks and sees the world. In that sense, obsession can actually be a sign that someone has found something that resonates deeply with them. The energy that might otherwise scatter in many directions begins to concentrate around a single pursuit. And that kind of focused attention is often where meaningful progress begins. But obsession can also take a very different direction. Sometimes the object of the obsession shifts. Instead of the work itself, the mind becomes fixated on the result that the work is supposed to produce. The attention moves forward in time and settles on the outcome, the recognition, the approval, the moment when everything will finally feel validated. Every action begins to feel like a step toward a verdict. You write something and immediately wonder how people will react to it. You build something and the question hovering is whether it will succeed or fail. That kind of obsession feels very different internally. It creates a constant tension because the thing you're focused on lives in the future. It's something that hasn't happened yet, something you can't fully control. And when the mind stays fixed there, it becomes difficult to be fully present with the work itself. An obsession with the process tends to pull your attention into what you're actually doing. The hours spent practicing, learning, experimenting begin to accumulate naturally. Skill grows almost quietly because your energy stays in the activity. An obsession with the outcome places your attention somewhere else entirely. Think about friendships, for example. Some of the strongest connections people form seem to emerge during periods when they weren't actively searching for them. They were simply living their lives, following their interests, focusing on their own growth. The connection appeared in that space almost naturally. Okay, but how can we channel that obsession toward the right things and avoid getting trapped by the wrong ones? People have noticed this problem for a very long time. Long before modern psychology or productivity advice existed, several philosophical traditions were already trying to understand why the human mind creates so much unnecessary pressure around outcomes. One of the traditions that approach this question is Taoism. Taoism thought spends a lot of time observing how people interpret events. The mind tends to label things very quickly. Something happens, and within seconds, we attach a judgment to it. Good, bad, a step forward, a setback. Taoist philosophy invites a different perspective. An event is simply an event. The meaning we assign to it often comes later, and sometimes the meaning changes as time passes. There's a well-known Taoist story that illustrates this idea through a very simple situation. A farmer loses his horse. The people in the village come to him and say how unfortunate he is. Losing a horse must be terrible luck. The farmer simply replies, maybe. A few days later, the horse returns and it brings several wild horses with it. The villagers come back and say how lucky he is. Now he has more horses than before. Again, the farmer responds, maybe. Later, his son tries to tame one of the wild horses and falls, breaking his leg. The villagers return and say how tragic the situation has become. The farmer gives the same answer, maybe. Soon after that, soldiers arrive in the village to recruit young men for a war. Because his son's leg is broken, he isn't taken. The story keeps unfolding like this. What Taoist philosophy points to is the way the mind rushes to define events whose full consequences we cannot possibly see yet. Life moves through long chains of cause and effect that only make sense when we look back at them years later. Obsessing over outcomes is often connected to that habit of constant judgment. The mind wants certainty. It wants to know immediately whether something is working or failing. It tries to force meaning onto events that are still unfolding. When you're deeply attached to a result, every small development becomes emotionally charged. A small obstacle feels like a signal that something is going wrong. A positive sign creates temporary relief. The mind keeps swinging back and forth as it tries to interpret the future in real time. Things happen, you respond to them, you continue moving. The energy stays directed toward the action available in the present moment instead of toward predictions about what the final outcome will be. At this point, there's a small paradox that's worth addressing. Because once people hear about this idea of detachment, a new kind of tension can quietly appear. You start thinking, okay, I need to become detached. I shouldn't care too much about the outcome. I should let things unfold. And very quickly, the mind turns detachment itself into a goal. You notice when you feel too invested in something, you attempt to practice detachment in the same way you might try to optimize a habit or improve a skill. But if you look closely, the mind has simply replaced one attachment with another. Before, the attachment was the outcome, now the attachment becomes the idea of being detached. The mind starts chasing a certain internal state. It wants to feel calm, balanced, and affected by results. And that creates its own kind of pressure because real detachment doesn't usually appear through force. You can't bully your mind into not caring. Human beings naturally form desires, expectations, hopes. Those things arise on their own. Trying to eliminate them completely often leads to another loop of frustration. Someone might sit there thinking, I'm still attached to this outcome. I shouldn't be attached. I need to be more detached. This is why many philosophical traditions that talk about detachment rarely describe it as something you directly chase. It tends to appear indirectly. When attention settles more consistently on the work itself, the grip on the outcome often loosens on its own. The mind has somewhere else to rest. The energy that used to circle around the result gradually shifts toward the activity that's happening right now. Imagine trying to fall asleep while constantly reminding yourself that you must relax. The more you monitor whether you're relaxed enough, the more alert the mind becomes. Sleep usually arrives when attention drifts away from that effort. Detachment has a similar quality. It grows quietly when the mind stops orbiting the outcome every few minutes. When the work becomes engaging enough to hold your attention, when curiosity becomes stronger than the constant need for reassurance about the future, that's when you become detached. The paradox is simple. If detachment becomes another thing you're desperately trying to achieve, the mind is still gripping something tightly. Let the desire exist. At the same time, bring your attention back to what can actually be done right now. The action, the practice, the work, the small steps unfolding in the present. Over time, that shift naturally softens the grip. You don't have to force detachment. You create the conditions where it can appear on its own. This is all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video, and yeah, see you in the next one. Bye.